November 16th, 2000, Houston, Texas. A 29-year-old man named Robert Earl Davis Jr. is found dead on the floor of his own recording studio. The world knew him as DJ Screw, the producer who slowed hip-hop down until it sounded like a dream you didn't want to wake up from. What stopped his heart wasn't heroin, it wasn't a needle, it was cough syrup. Codeine, the mild opioid a doctor would hand a child with a cold, poured into a styrofoam cup with soda and sipped like a soft drink. The same molecule is sitting behind the counter at a CVS near you right now, filed under a label that says it's the gentle one. This is where it begins. Codeine starts where every opioid starts, with a flower. The opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, is one of the oldest plants humans ever learned to farm. Archaeologists have pulled its seed capsules out of a cave floor near Granada, Spain, and out of waterlogged Neolithic lake villages in Italy, and radiocarbon dated them to somewhere between roughly 4,000 and 5,600 years before Christ. Sit with that. People were deliberately growing this flower more than 7,000 years ago, over 5,000 years before there was a United States for anyone to grow anything in. It is a strange plant to build an empire of medicine on. In bloom, it's almost delicate, papery red or lilac petals on a pale green stalk. But the part that mattered wasn't the flower. It was the round seed pod left behind after the petals dropped. Late in the day, ancient farmers would take a small curved blade and score shallow lines across the skin of that pod. Overnight, a milky white sap would weep out of the cuts, and as it hit the air, oxidize into a sticky brown gum with a bitter, earthy smell. At dawn, they'd scrape it off by hand. That brown gum was opium, the raw, unrefined ancestor of every drug in this story. The scoring had to be shallow, the timing had to be right, and the whole ritual was repeated, pod, by hand, for thousands of years across the ancient Mediterranean. Opium turns up everywhere the early written record reaches. Egyptian medical texts from around 1550 BC describe poppy preparations. Greek physicians used it for pain and for sleep. You'll sometimes hear that the ancient Sumerians called the poppy the joy plant more than 5,000 years ago. That specific claim is shaky and probably a mistranslation, so set it aside. What isn't shaky is the bigger picture. For millennia, across an arc of the world larger than the entire American Southwest, human beings knew this flower could kill pain, quiet a cough, and, if you took too much, kill you. They just had no way to control which. For all those thousands of years, opium was a gamble. You swallowed the whole brown gum, and its strength depended on the plant, the season, the batch. One dose might do nothing. The next might not let you wake up. Nobody could separate the medicine from the danger because nobody could see what was inside. The breakthrough, when it came, wasn't agricultural, it was chemical. Around 1804, a young German pharmacist's assistant named Friedrich Serturner did something no one had managed before. He isolated a single pure compound out of raw opium. He named it after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. He called it morphine. For the first time in human history, opium's power could be weighed, measured, and dosed by the milligram. And once chemists knew the poppy could be taken apart, they went looking for what else was in it. In 1832, a French chemist in Paris named Pierre-Jean Robiquet pulled out a second alkaloid, a milder cousin of morphine. He named it after the Greek word kodeia, meaning poppy head. He called it codeine. Here is the fact that shaped everything that followed. Codeine makes up only about half of 1% of opium, while morphine makes up roughly 10%. There's so little natural codeine in the poppy that to this day, most codeine isn't extracted at all. It's manufactured by chemically tweaking morphine in a lab. Codeine was, from the moment of its birth, defined by what it wasn't. It was the weak one. Somewhere between a fifth and a tenth of morphine's strength, depending on how you measure it. The poppy that had been a single unpredictable gum was now a shelf of named molecules. Morphine, the powerful one. Codeine, the gentle one. And that word, gentle, was about to do more damage than anything on that shelf, because codeine carried a secret in its chemistry, one nobody would understand for another 150 years. And when they finally did, it would turn the safe one into a lie. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel covers the hidden histories behind the things that shape the world. Real stories, real numbers, no filler. New video every day. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Whether you're in Texas, New York, or somewhere in between, I always want to know. Codeine never built a political empire. It never sparked a war or toppled a dynasty. What it built was quieter, and in the end, far more durable. Codeine became the opioid that civilization decided to trust, and it earned that trust precisely by being weak. Because it was mild, codeine could go where morphine was too dangerous to follow, out of the operating room and the battlefield hospital, and into the most ordinary place imaginable, the family bathroom. It became the world's default middle step for pain. To this day, the World Health Organization's pain treatment ladder lists codeine as the gentle rung, the thing you reach for after aspirin stops working, but before you resort to morphine. But codeine's real killer app wasn't pain at all, it was the cough. Codeine quiets the reflex in the brain that makes you cough, which meant it could be poured into syrup and sold by the bottle. And it was, on a scale that dwarfs any needle drug in history. Consider two numbers. First, through the 20th century, codeine became one of the most widely used opioids on the planet, sitting in more American medicine cabinets than heroin and morphine ever reached combined. Second, and stranger. For most of that century, in much of the United States, codeine cough syrup lived in a legal category so relaxed you could buy it with no prescription at all. Just sign a logbook at the pharmacy counter and show you were 18. Picture what that empire actually looked like. Not palaces. Bathroom cabinets. A brown or purple bottle by the sink. Terpene hydrate and codeine. Robitussin AC, Shericol. A spoonful measured out for a child's nighttime cough. A tab of Tylenol with codeine after a dentist's appointment. The most powerful family of drugs the world has ever known, domesticated down into a household staple you kept next to the mouthwash. This wasn't new behavior. Americans had been dosing themselves and their children with opium's gentler faces since long before the country industrialized. For generations, paregoric, a weak tincture of opium, was rubbed on the gums of teething babies and spooned out for upset stomachs, sold openly at any general store. Codeine slid neatly into that same cultural groove. It went into soldiers' kits in both world wars to quiet coughs and dull pain in the field. It went into hospital carts, dental offices, and the standard American cold and flu shelf. By the second half of the 20th century, codeine was so ordinary that most of the people swallowing it couldn't have told you it was chemically a cousin of heroin. It didn't feel like a narcotic. It felt like Tylenol. That casualness never fully went away. It's still written into American drug law, where codeine is split across different tiers of control depending on what it's mixed with. Some forms locked down, some barely watched at all. But the very thing that made codeine safe on paper, its weakness, was about to collide with something no chemist had accounted for: human genetics. Here is the secret buried in codeine's chemistry, the one Robiquet never knew he'd created. Codeine, by itself, barely works. It's what pharmacologists call a prodrug, an inactive package that does almost nothing until your body converts it into something else. In your liver, an enzyme with the unglamorous name CYP2D6 turns codeine into morphine. That's where the pain relief actually comes from. The mild opioid is really just a slow-release delivery system for the strong one. And how much morphine you make depends on genes you were born with. Most people convert about 10% of a codeine dose into morphine, but some people carry extra copies of that gene. Doctors call them ultra-rapid metabolizers, and their livers convert codeine into morphine far faster and far more completely than everyone else's. Same bottle, same spoonful, a completely different drug, depending on DNA nobody ever tested for. For almost all of codeine's history, no one knew any of this, which means that for generations, doctors handed the mild opioid to the most vulnerable patients alive, small children, after routine surgery. Picture a 4-year-old, home from a tonsillectomy, one of the most common childhood operations in America. The surgeon sends the family off with codeine for the pain. A parent measures out exactly the dose on the label, exactly as directed. In an ordinary child, it takes the edge off. In an ultra-rapid metabolizer, that same careful dose floods a small body with morphine. The child gets sleepy, then quiet, then still. That is not a hypothetical. Between 1969 and 2015, the FDA's own adverse event reporting system logged 64 cases of children with serious breathing problems after taking codeine. 24 of them died. Most were under 12. The ones who were tested came back as ultra-rapid metabolizers. Their livers had turned a spoonful of cough medicine into a fatal overdose of morphine. And here's what made it so hard to see coming. Being an ultra-rapid metabolizer isn't rare or exotic. Depending on a person's ancestry, it runs anywhere from roughly 1 in 100 to nearly 1 in 10. There was no way to spot those children by looking at them. No symptom, no warning, no test anyone was running. Same syrup, same measuring spoon, same instructions on the box, and for a small and unlucky fraction of kids, an entirely different drug. When the FDA's warnings finally landed, the prescribing changed almost overnight. Pediatric codeine prescriptions in the United States fell by roughly half in the space of 3 years. The fix, once someone insisted on it, was that simple, which tells you how long the not fixing had been allowed to run. While those deaths were quietly accumulating in a federal database, a second body count was building in public, on the radio. In Houston in the 1990s, a generation turned prescription codeine and promethazine cough syrup into something they called lean. Purple syrup poured into a double-stacked styrofoam cup, cut with Sprite and a melted Jolly Rancher, sipped slow. DJ Screw made it the sound of a city, and then it killed him in 2000 at 29. His protege, Big Mo, who named albums after the drink, died in 2007 at 33. That same year, the rapper Pimp C was found dead in a hotel room. Codeine and promethazine, compounded by sleep apnea. 33 years old. The safe drug had a body count in the pediatric recovery ward and on the Billboard charts at the same time. Quick question. How many opioid prescriptions do you think American pharmacies filled in a single year at the peak of all this? Just hold a number in your head. We'll come back to it. The United States never grew the poppy, but it did something more consequential than farming. America became the world's most enthusiastic consumer of the mild opioid, and it built the legal machinery that kept codeine feeling harmless. Start with the trust. Codeine's most familiar American form was Tylenol, with codeine, Tylenol number 3, on a prescription pad. That meant codeine rode into tens of millions of homes wearing the most reassuring brand name in the American medicine cabinet. A product line run by McNeil, the consumer arm of Johnson & Johnson, headquartered in New Brunswick, New Jersey. When the label says Tylenol, nobody flinches. Then look at the law. When Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act in 1970, it sorted every drug into tiers by danger. Pure, single-ingredient codeine landed in Schedule 2. Serious controls, prescription required. But codeine, mixed into cough syrup, below a certain limit, dropped all the way down to Schedule 5, the lowest tier there is, the same broad trust category as an anti-diarrhea medicine. And in that watered-down form, in much of the country, it could be sold over the counter, no prescription needed. Think about what that meant. A regulator's pen decided that because this particular opioid was weak, it belonged on the honor system, a controlled narcotic you could sign for at the drugstore, right next to the cough drops. That leniency wasn't new either. It traced back to the country's very first federal drug law. When Congress passed the Harrison Narcotics Act in 1914 to finally rein in opium and cocaine, it deliberately carved out an exemption for preparations that contained only small amounts of codeine and a few other drugs. the so-called exempt narcotics. The reasoning was simple. These were too weak to bother with. So while morphine got locked behind the counter, codeine cough syrup stayed out on the shelf, available to anyone willing to sign the pharmacist's register, a name in a book. And you walked out holding an opioid. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. It taught a century of Americans that such a thing as a casual opioid existed, that there was a member of the family you didn't have to be afraid of. For decades, that even looked like wisdom. Codeine seemed to be living proof that opioids could be tamed, measured, managed, made mild. Doctors reached for it freely. Parents kept it on the shelf. Nobody was hiding anything. And that was exactly the problem. The whole country had absorbed a comforting piece of common sense that turned out to be false, that a weak enough opioid was a safe enough opioid. What the record shows next is what the agency that was supposed to be watching already had sitting in its own files, and had had by then for decades. The failure at the center of Codeine's story isn't a scheming executive in a boardroom. It's an institution that had the evidence in hand and moved at the speed of paperwork. Name it plainly, the Food and Drug Administration. The reports came in for decades, children who stopped breathing on a normal dose of a medicine everyone called mild. The first one reached the FDA in 1969. By 2015, the agency's adverse event database held those 64 pediatric cases and 24 deaths. Sit with those 2 years. 1969, 2015. 46 years of reports about children dying from a cough syrup, filed and counted and stored. I want to be careful and honest here, because this is where a lesser story would invent a villain. There is no secret memo in the public record where some executive weighed a child's life against cough syrup revenue. I went looking for it, and the truth is worse in its own quiet way. Nobody had to decide to keep giving codeine to children, because the safe label meant nobody was ever forced to look hard at whether they should. The action, when it finally came in slow, incremental steps. In 2007, the FDA added a note about breastfeeding to the label. In 2012, a safety communication. In 2013, the agency issued its strongest possible warning, a boxed warning, against giving codeine to children after tonsillectomy. And only in April of 2017, 48 years after that first report, did the FDA finally contraindicate codeine for every child under 12, for pain and for cough alike. The following January, in 2018, the agency extended that restriction to prescription cough and cold medicines. That is how long it took the system to simply stop handing a morphine-producing drug to children with runny noses, the better part of half a century after the first one died. You don't need me to tell you how to feel about a 48-year gap between the first warning sign and the final restriction. Here's what the record shows. The label said mild, so the system treated it as mild, for decades after its own files said otherwise. The safe idea protected itself the way these things usually do, not through conspiracy, but through inertia and design. That low schedule, over-the-counter status kept codeine flowing casually for generations. And when its cough syrup form became lean and started killing musicians in public, the market barely blinked. In 2014, one major manufacturer, Actavis, voluntarily pulled its promethazine and codeine syrup, citing how widely it was being abused. Other companies simply kept making it and selling it. But the deepest cost codeine left behind isn't a single death toll. It's an idea. Codeine spent 150 years teaching Americans that an opioid could be safe as long as you called it mild enough. And that idea didn't die with codeine. It's the exact promise a company called Purdue would later sell to the entire country in a time-released tablet called OxyContin. Here's the present-day American bill for treating opioids as ordinary consumer products. It is now the deadliest drug crisis in the nation's history. More than 1 million Americans have died of drug overdoses since 1999. And even after 3 straight years of decline, the CDC estimates that roughly 69,973 people died of overdose in 2025 alone. More people, every single year, than live in a city the size of Flint, Michigan, erased. Codeine is a small line in that enormous ledger, but it wrote the opening argument. None of this came to light through a leak or a whistleblower. It was in plain sight the whole time, in the FDA's own safety communications, in the CDC's mortality data, in coroner's reports out of Houston. The evidence was never hidden. We just weren't looking at the mild one. The FDA had the first report in 1969. The contraindication for children under 12 didn't arrive until 2017. In between lay 48 years, and a generation that grew up believing the bottle by the bathroom sink was harmless. Codeine is still here, legal, common, and still wearing the same reassuring label. It's in Tylenol with codeine on the prescription pad. It's in codeine cough syrups behind the pharmacy counter at your CVS and your Walgreens. It's in generic bottles in millions of American medicine cabinets, a spoonful away from anyone with a bad cough. Now, remember that number I asked you to hold. At the peak, in 2012, American pharmacies filled roughly 255 million opioid prescriptions in a single year. That's nearly enough for a bottle for every adult in the United States. Codeine, the friendly one, was always one of the most trusted faces in that pile. And lean never left either. The double-stacked cup still shows up in music videos and at parties. It's still taking people. The rapper Fredo Santana died in 2018 at 27, after years of open codeine use. The purple in the cup is the same molecule Robiquet named in a Paris lab in 1832. It's in your medicine cabinet. It's behind the counter at the drugstore you'll drive past this week. And the 2 liter of Sprite in your refrigerator door is one prescription away from the drink that killed DJ Screw. Codeine's entire story turns on a single word: mild. We didn't decide codeine was safe because anyone proved it was. We decided it because we wanted a version of the poppy we didn't have to fear. And codeine, weak enough to sell without a prescription, let us believe we'd finally found one. For nearly 2 centuries, the label said gentle, while the chemistry quietly turned in certain bodies into the very same morphine Sir Turner pulled out of opium in 1804. The safe one and the dangerous one were never really 2 different drugs. They were the same drug, wearing different names, waiting on your genes. That's the real lesson underneath 200 years of cough syrup. The gap between what America promised itself, informed choice, honest labels, a fair shot at knowing what you're putting in your body, and the reality of a narcotic sold on the honor system for 100 years because it was convenient to call it harmless. So here's the question worth sitting with. How many things in your life right now are called safe? Not because anyone proved they were, but because it was easier for everyone if you believed it. Let that one sit for a second. Have you ever kept a bottle of prescription cough syrup or leftover painkillers in your cabinet long after you needed it? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the real history behind the things that quietly run your life, subscribe. Hit the like button. It tells me you want to keep going deeper. And share this with someone who thinks they already know how the world works. The next time a pharmacist slides a bottle across the counter and calls it mild, you'll know exactly what mild has cost. Codeine never hid in the shadows. It hid in plain sight, in the medicine cabinet, in the double cup, in the one word we all agreed to trust. And now you can't unsee it.